All right, Tariq, we are now live. Nice to have you here, man.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So would love to kind of start with where you enter the scene on this whole greenwashing thing, because in kind of defining what that means, because that's how I originally heard of you, and would love to give some people context on really, about yourself and how it relates to that.
Got it. Well, let me spend 5 seconds on my background because it'll kind of make sense. I
Perfect.
spent a bunch of time as a banker and then as an investor doing the whole sort of Wall Street thing. It was not really my passion, but I kind of got hoovered into it after college 20 years ago. And then in 2013, I left and created Roomie, which I now run. It's a nonprofit education organization. We're making like the Wikipedia of free learning at roomie.org. And then I joined BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager. It's the largest asset manager in history, $9 trillion under management. And the idea was that in theory, I was kind of merging a little bit of what I'd done on both sides. So I was using the Wall Street, the financial mechanics, and then the nonprofit experience and building social impact to say, hey, can we do both at the same time, right? Like sustainable investing, impact investing. You make a good investment return. It's good for business and it's also good for the world.
Awesome, man. So, in real quick, before we get into BlackRock and greenwashing, can you talk a little bit about Roomie?
Yeah, so Roomie, we basically try to make learning new job skills, life skills, career skills as fun and easy as possible. So, we go to roomie.org. It's all mobile first. It's all 5-minute, like 5 or 6 minute micro courses, right? And we use a micro learning approach because it helps people learn better. It actually has better learning retention. And it's just super engaging, right? So we've found that since the pandemic, we grew it from 0 to over 100,000 users. We're growing the courses on it that are created through crowdsourcing. And it's really just an easy and safe way for people to actually, interestingly, get a dopamine rush from learning a new skill. So I know we're talking about Facebook and the pre-thing, but it's kind of competitive with social media because like nearly 90% of youth who are using it say that it replaces social media time because, you could either take a 6-minute hit on Instagram or you could, build a new skill.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, you see like, book summaries and things that are informational on YouTube, but I know that's not most of the content that's getting consumed on those platforms. So it's cool that you're leveraging the same kind of, approach with something that's a lot more productive.
That's the goal, right? I mean, again, a dopamine rush, like, because everyone, you use like social media when you're bored, right? People are waiting for the bus. They're in the bathroom, probably, whatever it is, you pull it out for 5 minutes and, it doesn't 6 minutes per Instagram session. The average person uses social media for over 2.5 hours per day. That was before the pandemic. So it's definitely gone up. It adds up, right? They're taking 5 minutes here and there. You get a dopamine rush. They sell you some ads. It's great for Zuckerberg. It's not so great for our mental health. And, we're hoping to be part of the solution to that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I want to come back to that, but and hear about how Roomie started. But can you talk to me about your experience at BlackRock and kind of why you left?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say what they're trying to do is in many ways seem really well intended. And anyway, my message is not specific to BlackRock; it's just the entire industry. It's the idea is that you can basically look at how so let's take a step back. What does Wall Street actually do, right? It's easy to lose sight of that because it kind of acts invisibly in all corners of the economy. And the best way to think about it is, Wall Street and the capital allocation process they govern connects the capital and the savings of people who save money, right? Like us in our bank account or our checking account, like the bank's actually doing something with that, or a pension fund that invests on our behalf for our long-term retirement. That's the money of savers, right? That belongs to everybody in society. Wall Street, effectively, the most important thing they do is they connect that money to uses of capital, right? So it's a company that wants to sell shares to the public, right? Tesla's trying to expand. They'll sell shares, or they'll sell bonds, and it's a really, really important process because the better that capital is allocated in our society, the more we end up with companies that can grow and create things that new medical things, vaccines, right? They create jobs. So it's really important. And the fundamental thing about ESG is really the idea is that like Wall Street's saying, hey, as we do capital allocation, we are going to also be the solution to society's problems in environmental and social areas because we have this thing called ESG, which is an acronym for environmental and social and sort of corporate governance. and we're going to start doing ESG stuff over what we're already doing. And it's going to mean that we can like both get great returns, and which is what they're really meant to be doing, right? Is getting a return on people's money, and we can like solve climate change and inequality and a whole bunch of other things. That's kind of generally the premise of sustainable investing or impact investing or ESG.
Okay. So this is what is being touted on Wall Street, but I guess what I'm wondering is, where is the disconnect between how it's being promoted and the reality of the impact that it's having?
I mean, the biggest issue is that there's no impact. It's having no impact, pretty much. So it's like the win-win is like a win for Wall Street. I'm not quite sure it's a win for society, which unfortunately is a recurring trend of allowing Wall Street to attempt to regulate itself, right? Is that it sort of ends up in a place where it makes a lot of money and no one else does. But, the idea is that they're moving, that either they're saying, listen, we're doing a bunch of stuff already, right? And now we're going to think about ESG when we do it, right? Anything we're doing normally. That idea is meant to get you to believe that, hey, listen, they're allocating capital, based on, a set of things that are going to lead to more money for good businesses that fight climate change and that pay people a good working wage and everything else. It'll transform capitalism. I can tell you from being in the middle of the machine as a former investor, like, it doesn't make any sense. Ultimately, the way Wall Street actually works is that they chase the most profit and yield. And that's the only thing they care about. And it's not because they're bad people. It's because that's how the system is designed to work, right? They have legal obligations, right? What's called fiduciary duty. It's if you're managing someone else's money, you have to actually do it based on a set of key criteria that are, generally speaking, always about dollar values and not social values, right? Like, you don't care if it's good for the world in 30 years. What you care about is the return on that investment, which may be 1 year or 6 months or whatever. And you care about that because you're legally required to. That's otherwise you wouldn't give other people your money, right? That's kind of how capitalism works. You need to have that comfort that you give the capital someone, they're doing what's in your best interest, and that has to be dollar value, right? It can't be values, because everybody has different values, right? That gets into politics. So they're saying they're doing a bunch of that, but in reality, like, Wall Street is doing kind of what they've always done because they're structured to do that. And I think the tragedy isn't that they're doing bad things; it's that they're saying that things that they can't possibly do. And in doing so, they're delaying government action, right? Because they're saying, oh, don't worry, we'll do all the right things. There's something called stakeholder capitalism. There's this idea that's starting to grow that the Business Roundtable, which is like the CEOs of the biggest companies in the US, got on, and they basically, they said, oh, we care about all stakeholders, because legally a company, most companies are registered in Delaware, right? Because it's very shareholder friendly in terms of its legal system. And so you have a situation where they're legally required to focus on profits, right? I mean, again, that's how the system works. But then they're kind of going out there from a marketing and PR perspective and saying, oh no, but we care about all stakeholders and not just shareholders. We care about communities and this and that. And to me, that's just a response to society basically saying we need better outcomes on the environment, right? We need better outcomes on societal issues. And what ought to happen is the government comes in and does their job. It's kind of like a sport. Imagine if you're playing a sport and, it's competitive and players are playing dirty. At some point, you need a referee, right? And Wall Street, the last thing that they want ever is taxes and regulation, even if it's in the long-term public interest, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's regulation on any of their activities. They're generally going to view that as undesirable. And so there's a heavy pushback. So part of it is them saying, oh, we're going to do all the stuff for all stakeholders, which really I think is vacuous when you actually look at what, having looked at the middle of the machine, it made no sense. It was just optics and marketing. So that's kind of delaying government action. And then at the same time, on the other hand, there's a growing social angst where people are saying, hey, you know what, like, nothing's getting done, right? And why isn't the government doing anything? Why isn't anyone doing anything on climate change? Every year or whatever, we hear more and more about it, and then like nothing actually happens. And on that, what they've done is they've started selling funds that they claim have impact, right? They'll say, oh, you, especially if you're younger and you're a millennial and you're particularly motivated by social issues, they'll basically take an existing fund, they'll make a few tiny changes that don't really do very much at all, and then they'll paint it green, right? And then they'll sell it to you. And there's a huge impetus to do it in the industry today because you basically can generate a lot more in fees, right? Because they know basically that if you have it's like if you go to the grocery store, you have like two apples and they look the exact same and they're every way the same, and then one of them has an organic sticker on it, like people are going to take that one, right? They're going to pay more for it. And so it's a question of consumer behavior. They kind of are selling a lot of the things that are very, very similar or very unchanged, but they can sell for more if it's got a green thing on it. And in the end, if you look at how the financial mechanics work underneath, it creates no impact at all. It's just moving money around. It's all optics, but it allows them to charge fees.
Yeah, it seems very strange. And there's this weird incentive structure too, where, like you said, people are incentivized to do that. You're managing somebody's money. You have to get the best return for them. And sometimes that might mean cutting corners that shouldn't be cut. And I love that you use the sports analogy. It makes me think like, I grew up playing hockey. So what if I was playing hockey and part of the rules were that you couldn't hit anybody, but the other team was hitting your team? It's like, you're not going to last very long. Like it's a hard thing to overcome. The incentive structure just isn't there. It makes me think of, I looked into RECs, the renewable energy credits. Are you familiar with this?
Somewhat, yeah.
And they were talking about how like you can do these green things, it kind of similar phenomenon, and generate these RECs. But in reality, none of the money to generate a REC was going into the addition of new solar panels, new, nuclear plant, whatever. It was just somehow, like you said, moving the money around and creating this illusion that you're really doing a good thing, but it doesn't really do anything, to your point. And what do you think the effect of that is? Because I know you've talked about the placebo effect before of telling people they're doing something right and really they're not making much of a difference.
I think it's actually extremely dangerous. It's funny. I actually left BlackRock in the industry at the late 2019. And I turned my focus back to Roomie, which I'd founded anyway before going to BlackRock, and was actually really well timed because in the pandemic people really needed remote or digital learning solutions. And so I left back then, but I didn't say anything about it publicly because I'd come to the conclusion that most of it was kind of hopeful marketing and optics. And I thought, well, this is not how capitalism is going to get reformed, right? It was just kind of like smoke and mirrors. And I said that as a trained investor going in and looking at all what they're saying, and I was like, it was a bit worrying, right? I looked at it and I said, this doesn't make any sense. So I left. And at that point, I analogized it to someone. They were like, well, is it harmful or not? And I said, it's kind of like giving wheatgrass to a cancer patient, right? Like if you have a cancer patient, the cancer's slowly spreading, and someone shows up and says, I have wheatgrass, these magical stories people have around like health foods and nutrition. So look at this wheatgrass, and they marketed it well and so on. They said, maybe it can help the cancer. You or I we're thinking, I'm in a tough situation. Like, let me buy this wheatgrass. It seems like a good option. And obviously it's not doing anything because there's no, these products don't do anything to address climate change or inequality. If you look at the last few years, really ESG and all the sustainable stuff that Wall Street's doing, it increases every year exactly alongside like carbon emissions, inequality, like all the things it's meant to address, because there's really no link between any of it, right? So I kind of looked and I was like, yeah, it's like wheatgrass to a cancer patient. And then I decided to go public earlier this year because over the last year and a half, I started paying attention and realizing, no, this is worse. It's actually misleading the public into believing that our solution lies in a set of things that don't do anything beyond produce, additional fees for these financial firms. And I started liking it to someone. I said, listen, I'm now realizing that the wheatgrass we're giving the cancer patient is convincing the patient to delay chemotherapy, right? And it's not like we don't know what to do to address inequality or climate change. We've known forever. Like there's economists who won the Nobel Prize years ago for saying that, we need aggressive climate legislation. We need a carbon tax. If you want to fight inequality, you have to actually rein in corporate power. You have to manage how they treat their employees so that they have bargaining power. Like there's a million things that have been suggested by all the best academics. The issue is we're not listening to them because the academics are generally saying, let's go back to the hockey analogy. I'm from Toronto, so I'm cool with all the hockey stuff.
Beautiful.
It's like you're kind of saying like the players are all on the ice, right? And and they're realizing they can play dirty and it wins games, and they end up doing better out of it, right? And the fans in the crowd eventually start saying, listen, like here are the solutions. But all of the solutions require updating the rules and getting the referees to enforce them, right? None of the solutions require or ask for good sportsmanship, because clearly that's not working on its own, right? But business doesn't want regulation in any way, shape, or form. They'll do anything to fight tax and regulation. And so ultimately, what they're pushing to the public is an idea based on good sportsmanship, right? They're saying stakeholder capitalism, and look at all, we're going to be net zero carbon emitters by 2050, and a whole bunch of voluntary non-binding pledges that are largely marketing. Because the unfortunate issue is that to solve a lot of society's problems, there's no magic bullet where everybody gets to, save the climate environment and make tons of money at the same time. Some of these are tough issues, and they're going to cost money and take sacrifice. And in a situation like that, when you have an inconvenient set of truths, people are very susceptible to convenient fantasies, frankly, right? That sound really good, where it's oh, I'll buy this ETF and then I'll put some savings in it and they'll save the world and make lots of money. And, but those don't exist. And the reality is that we just need serious government-led policy reform to address these issues. Yeah,
you had a great quote on Twitter that I want to read. You said, "Sustainababble has hit epic proportions," which I think that's just a fantastic word there. And yet little to none of it has vaguely any measurable real world social impact. And, as you explained, there's evidence that it's a deadly distraction and it's delaying overdue government-led systemic reforms. And I think that's well said and speaks to, what you just mentioned there. As much as free markets are great and they solve a lot of problems, they don't solve all the problems, and you can't just have free reign. A hockey game without refs would be chaos.
It would make no sense. By the way, the other thing is that there is no such thing as a free market. Anytime you ever hear anyone saying the free market will solve a problem that needs to be solved, honestly, I would tell you all you need, what I hear when I hear that is that this person enjoys the status quo and they don't want status quo to change. Because every time they say it, doesn't even make any sense. There is no free market. You know what I mean? Every market has rules. It's like every sport has rules. You can't play a sport without rules. It's a competition, right? Every market, even today, has rules. There's rules around property taxes. There's rules around pollution. Do you pay fines, when, how? There's rules around, what you could pay people, right? How you treat them. There's all kinds of regulations, right? And every single, how long do you get patent protection, private property? All of these things exist. And you'll have a bunch of people, and I'll be openly disparaging about when they're the free market will solve this. It's complete bullshit. Yeah. It's there is no free market. There's a set of rules, and they obviously think that those set of rules are very good for them, right? So they'll say, "Oh, the free market," which is just kick the can down the road. And that's what's the most annoying thing about sort of what the financial service industry is doing on all this stuff, is that it comes directly at the expense of the youngest people in society, including their own employees. Right. So if you're at one of these big finance firms and your CEO is 65 or 70, they gain the most from the status quo, and they're least at risk of the consequences of continued inaction. They're going to go out there and they're going to say, "Oh, I want to fight for inequality, whether it's racial or wealth or income inequality. I want to fight climate change." But the reality is they're 70 years old. Net zero pledge, in 2050 is going to be when they're 100. Right. They're kind of the gain from the system, and they don't bear the consequences of inaction, but their employees 25 is in the exact opposite situation, right? They're the bottom of the totem pole, and then all of the these longer term issues where we're kicking the can down the road to satisfy a system that is extraordinarily short term oriented. It'll be really their own younger employees who end up picking up the pieces at the end when prevention beats cure, right? In terms of cost, and we're not preventing anything right now.
Yeah, we're pretty good at that.
Yeah.
We're pretty good at focusing on cures instead of preventions.
Yeah.
In more ways than one. But yeah, it's unfortunate. There's a famous proverb or something about planting a tree that you'll never be in the shade of. It's a noble thing to do, but kind of like we talked about, there's just no incentive structure for that to be done right now. Everything is very short-term oriented. And I think until that fundamentally changes, we're going to get more variations of the same and more, distractions and fireworks, such as this greenwashing, that kind of distract from the root of the problem, it seems. What do you see as the solution to this?
I think that, honestly, I think it's young people in particular need to grab this mantle, because they're the ones that are getting screwed the most. If you have a very short-term oriented system, it's going to squeeze out as much value as it can today and kick the consequences down to other people because, frankly, they just care about the next quarter, right? I mean, think of it this way. The average CEO, the amount of time they stay as a CEO is the shortest it's been in decades. It's now 5 years. It used, there was 10 or 15 years. They're only in that role for 5 years. But this average CEO also gets paid higher than they've ever got paid at any point in history in the past. So the average CEO gets 320 times the average industry worker for that industry. So they're there for a short time, shorter than they've been for decades, and they get paid way more than they've gotten paid in decades, right? So you have an extremely short-term mindset because no matter what they say, I mean, I'm sure they want to be good people at the end of the day. I'm not saying they don't, but like when it starts costing money, their incentives, their own stock and their pay and everything are just very, very like focused the next few years. So you have a situation where like all of the expensive changes that we need made to like actually, spend 10 or 20 or 30 years rebuilding an energy system or building a sustainable or inclusive economy, those don't register on their timeline, right? And so the only one to me who can actually do that is the government, right? The government is there playing the role of referee, right? To preserve the long-term public interest, right? Like I'm not trusting a company to put a baby seat on the shelf that I would buy, based on their promises that like they think it's cool. Like certain things are regulated. We know that's how we know we're not getting served poison at the supermarket, or that's how we can trust that the rivers aren't getting people just dumping pollution in, right? Those, the government exists to preserve the long-term public interest, and it has a legitimacy to do it because, much as we may hate our politicians, we do get a chance to choose them sort of every 4 years or 5 years. And so I think that one thing for me that I think was really interesting about COVID-19 was that you saw a systemic threat where people said we have to flatten the curve, right? It was an infections curve. And so people didn't leave it to the free market or like some system where you can just kind of let's leave it and see what happens. Suddenly you had a whole bunch of baby boomer, like in particular leaders all being like, oh man, like we need to like use government action, close bars, close schools, make masks mandatory indoors, restrict travel. All of these things were done on varying levels, but in, across the country. And it had to be done. Otherwise, probably millions of people would have died. But then when you get to climate change, it's, a systemic curve, which science says we need to flatten. It's the greenhouse gas emissions curve. But because the incubation period, unlike COVID, which is a few weeks, climate change is a few decades, all of the same like leaders who are like, oh yeah, we need government action on COVID. You turn to them on climate change and they're like, we'll just leave it to the free market. Like, we'll just like leave it and see what gets figured out. And it makes no sense, right? Because there are lots of good policy suggestions where the government can, effectively change the rules of the game to facilitate a green transition. But again, that doesn't suit the interests of a lot of the current players, right? So they're going to push back even if it's long-term disaster for society.
Yeah, no, it's unfortunate. And I don't know, it seems like until that changes, people are going to keep taking the path of least resistance. But what meaningful changes do you think governments can make to kind of help with some of this?
I think I would say, so let's think about, I think climate change and inequality are the two biggest challenges that, look, companies can be great and do nice things on their own, but those are the two big ones that you need government to move the needle. So let's take climate change as an example. For COVID-19, the government did two things to get out of the crisis. With one hand, government flattened the curve by closing a whole bunch of places and doing things that, whenever it spiked up, you got the thing back under control. So they used, serious approaches that weren't just like voluntary. They were like mandatory things where they forcibly closed places. They apply penalties. These are not again, this is not good sportsmanship, right? There's a referee out there enforcing it. So one hand, they're holding down the curve. With the other hand, while they were holding down the curve, they then went and invested heavily in vaccines, right? Because they said, well, we need an escape plan. And so again, government, they made Operation Warp Speed, for what it's worth, was a success, right? This is Trump's thing, because it led to emergency rapid approval processes, right? So you could get a vaccine approved. They had direct R&D funding to pharmaceutical companies to make sure that they're basically doing R&D on this as fast, throwing all their resources at it. They also did pre-orders from multiple companies. So the logic is if you're one of these companies, you don't really want to spend all the money to do all the research, and then you get beaten by a couple of other players, and then they sell the whole market. Sure. So government goes out there and says, listen, we'll guarantee you a set of pre-orders so that you have an incentive to, you have like 8 horses basically all running, the same race. And so if a few of them fail, we know we're going to get to a working vaccine as fast as possible. So they're doing both these things with both hands. Basically, policy experts are saying the exact same with respect to climate change, right? They're saying you need a set of mandatory and systemic actions that are not just voluntary good sportsmanship, like you have to be enforced by law, that flatten the greenhouse gas emissions curve, right? So carbon tax would be one of the biggest things. Vehicle emissions limits would be another, energy efficiency standards for buildings. There's no question they're going to cost money, but that goes without saying. I mean, that is that's why climate change is a crisis, that it is going to cost something, right? So, but the faster we do it, the better. So, hold down the curve in one hand. They haven't really enacted most of those things in any meaningful form. And then with the other hand, just like there was Operation Warp Speed defined an escape plan, right? New vaccines, they could do the exact same thing to aggressively, while holding down carbon emissions, start investing in low carbon solutions. And that could be anything from like building out electric vehicle infrastructure in the country, right? I mean, government's got to lead doing that. That's the kind of thing that's part of an infrastructure bill. And, it's going to cost money, but government can lead and build that out, and that'll make it easier for people to make that transition. There's just a whole host of things that they can do that would speed things up, investing in carbon capture and storage, other new renewable technology, battery technologies. There's a bunch of things they can do, and it hasn't really been done in a meaningful form yet.
Yeah, obviously changing the entire energy infrastructure of, the entire economy would be a large feat and wouldn't happen instantly. But to your point, like I can see how people are upset that more meaningful steps towards it hasn't been taken, and has been kind of washed over with this greenwashing thing. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. It makes me wonder though, there's how do you have faith in, like, so the whole, you mentioned COVID and the whole lockdown thing. I know that's gotten a lot of scrutiny for, people claiming that we've had the biggest transfer of wealth to, the 1% and that kind of thing.
Right.
And people have been critical about, the government cracking down for that reason. But obviously, like, you need government, like, to facilitate things. How do you approach, like, balancing that and making sure that, the refs on the ice aren't skewing everything for one team? Like, you don't want to be totally nihilistic, right? But you need government. Like, we know this. Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the challenge, right? At the end of the day, when you go back to government, then you talk about politics, and then it all becomes kind of hopeless. It feels a little bit hopeless because, it's like people, I was not a fan of President Trump, but I already said I'm from Canada, so it wouldn't be that much of a surprise. That being said, I'm very empathetic when I listen to the voters, right? Because I think that, there's clearly grievances that they have that aren't being addressed by either party, right? And so there's this anti-establishment push, and you saw in 2016, whether it was Sanders or Trump, people were asking for something outside the norm. And so, the challenge though with Trump was that, much as his the people who support him, many of them have like good motives at the end of it. I would imagine, he himself wasn't particularly competent, shall we say. And so the challenge a little bit was that you couldn't really make the argument that government's the answer while like he's the government, because it's kind of like we're like walking somewhere far away, and then we're like, oh man, we should drive a car, and then the only person who has a license is wasted. And you think to yourself, like, you know what I mean? Like, this is the answer, but not right now. But yeah. I think now there's actually a government in place that I think if they have the political wind on their back, the important thing to recognize is they're the only ones who actually have the tools to do it, right? They're the only ones who be the referees. And there are systemic crises that, markets can't solve on their own, right? I always say it's like a pandemic is one, because you need border controls, you need fast action, you need new laws, you need massive spending and changes. Obviously, only government can do that. You can't leave it to like random companies operating independently. But I think that, there's things inside that people want to need that for. Climate change is another. I always say, alien invasions. if there was an alien invasion tomorrow, you know what I mean? Like you wouldn't leave it to the CEO of BlackRock to like figure it out. You know what I mean? Like there's a government for a reason, right? And so, I honestly think that climate change, one of the most interesting ideas I'd seen was moving it to the Department of Defense and saying they should lead the fight against climate change, because it would be understood more as a threat to American society over the long term, even if it's slow moving and insidious and all that kind of stuff. But it helps people think about it in that way. The challenge though is that as you get back to politics, right? People say, okay, well, fine, how do we get anything done? The challenge is that it's political parties is one issue wherever your political stripes are. I think the bigger issue is the amount of money in politics, right? It's quite difficult to change status quo and make the tax system more fair, for example, when the people who gain the most from the current tax system have now been given the gift of being able to use that money to like protect it, right? The system is going to work exactly as expected will. If you give everyone who has all the money and is getting all the money can spend that money to protect it, they're obviously going to do it. And democracy is supposed to have safeguards so that it's really around, the public interest and people voting individually and so on. And, at some point, if you have that much money in politics, it is skewing the system and slowing down any kind of change.
Yeah, it's concerning, right? Like I heard you even talk about lobbies in the business world and in like relevance to greenwashing and stuff. And you have interests that are, have financial means. And like
Right.
anytime you have that, interest on the side that you've got to, pay some, respect to, let's say, it screws up, the incentive that you have to do your job well. And we see this in both business and politics. And it's something else that I think about a lot. Because it's just the same incentive structure. As a young person, I would love to see that change, but I don't know what that looks like. I'm not smart enough to. I'm only smart enough to ask the questions, Tariq. So
honestly, asking the questions is the first step, right? Because I mean, at some point, the solution only comes when you figure out that like what you're doing now isn't working, right? Or I put it this way, if the solution's chemotherapy for a lot of these things, it's going to be painful and sucks. That's why it's like a cancer, right? That's why it's unfortunate that we have to deal with this. But the earlier we figure out that what we're having now is wheatgrass and not chemotherapy, probably the better, right? So having that conversation is really important because it leads to a fresh way of thinking about it and hopefully solutions that move the lever sooner.
Yeah, 100%. There's a saying that you want to be. Have this certain optimism that it's going to work out while simultaneously acknowledging the most ugly realities of your situation, like simultaneously, and holding those two things together is hard to do, especially, when there's extra money involved on the side. But no, it's interesting. So kind of on that note, do you think that most of the people involved in steering the policy for related to sustainable investing and climate change and stuff, do you think they have good intentions, or is it more of a conscious decision to choose self-interest over?
It's a really good question. I would tell you honestly that I don't think most people who are working on it realize, I think, in the same way. One of the challenges I saw was there wasn't that many investors actually doing it. It's weird. It's an investment area, but then like you go in and there's not that many people who have really hardcore investment experience, which means it might be harder for them to see holes in the thesis. Like I liken it to like, imagine if you joined Facebook and they had an ethical programming division, right? And then you get in there and then you're the only one who's ever written any code before. Like it would seem to be a little bit odd. And so that's one thing I noticed is that the industry had less investors, like hardcore investors, than any other area of investing that I'd seen. And again, I'd done something called vulture investing, which is extremely aggressive, like bankruptcy style. It just happened to be where I worked early in my career. And so, I don't think most people actually know they think generally speaking that they're helping, and there's a lot of young people doing it, and they're all in it for the right reasons, which is, they have an understanding that, these problems need to be fixed and they want to work on solving them. But I'm not sure if necessarily would know how all the pieces fit together, because what they're doing sometimes is like creating data to help measure if a company is actually responsible or not. That's great. But, if all you're doing is creating data to understand that, that's not enough, right? That's like saying, I'm going to understand if the player's sportsmanlike or not. Okay, great. Yeah, but like we still need a referee to like penalize them if they're not. And so I don't know that a lot of them would look at economic history and realize that in the 1980s, there's a set of like ideologies that started to spread under the Thatcher, Reagan, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan eras in the US and UK. And these people call them neoliberalism or whatever, but generally speaking, it's these ideas of like the free market will solve all problems. And, it may have had some value, it created some economic growth for a period, but at some point it swings too far in a certain direction and you need significant changes. And those haven't happened. And the most fascinating example is the financial crisis, right? 2008 happens. Obviously, there's no surprise it comes 10 years after the government deregulated a bunch of key things around the financial services industry, separating investment banks from commercial banks. 98, 10 years later, everything blows up. And yet the reforms that came after it have not been nearly aggressive enough to really reduce that risk. In many ways, there's more risk in the financial system in various areas. And so, it's one of these things where like there's an set of ideologies that seem to always pervade that say the answer is, and then whatever it is in the fine print, it's just going to be good sportsmanship. It's all they're trying to keep off the government and taxes and regulation. ESG is effectively that, right? It's a mechanism for social change to happen that happens without any government action or any rule changes. It runs counter to what every single serious economist is saying, right? The guy who won the Nobel 3 years ago in economics was talking about carbon tax and so on. I don't know that people working in the industry have really internalized yet that actually they're contributing to a placebo, because not only does it not really have any real life impact, but, and this is the really worrying part, it seems to actively be distracting people from the things that do have impact. I would be willing to bet that most people haven't really thought about it in that way. Where I would lay a little bit of, I won't say blame, but I'd have suspicion, are the senior most people at these firms. There's no fucking way they don't know that this is bullshit. And I swear very intentionally in that, because there's no way that they could not know that there's a system that's based on incentives that do not align in the current situation to the outcomes that they're out there on stage saying that they want. And to me, I look at it and I say, that seems really convenient, because it's not going to work for society, and they should know that. But then I look at their incentives and I say, it does work for your incentives, right? Like it certainly means shareholder value is going to be higher in the next few years, and you're making money off, this outcome is going to be bad for society, but good for you personally. And there's an old saying on Wall Street that everyone talks their book, right? It's like the idea is like they go on TV and they're saying to buy the stock, it's probably because they already own it and they want you to push the value up, or vice versa. And so, their best ideas are going to be the ones that happen to like align with whatever they want you to do, so they make more money. And this, on some level, for the senior most folks, they know that this doesn't add up, and they've seen enough years of history to know that it not only doesn't add up, but it looks like they're talking their book. And I think that, a lot of them more need to have integrity and come up and say, listen, we just went through a systemic crisis. It required significant government action to solve. This one is significantly more dangerous, even if it's slower moving. And every single expert saying we need serious government action. Like, we need to start talking about that sooner than later.
Yeah, it's based on what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense, especially when I think about, I was telling you, Cassandra Spencer, Facebook whistleblower, was on a few weeks ago, and she was saying, about people that are like promoting like overly progressive ideas that are kind of detrimental to the foundation of progress in the first place. She was saying that like the people at the top, they're the ones that know what's going on and that are being a little bit more malicious, a little bit more malicious, to put it lightly. And really the people that are underneath them, such as the people that are putting together the data that you were talking about, are really just the useful idiots that don't know any better, really. That's probably a harsh term, useful idiots, but the premise is there.
No, you know what? I would just say they're cogs in the machine, right?
Yeah.
They're cogs in the machine. It's not their own fault. I was a cog in the machine. People, that's how you start. You start as a cog, and then you eventually work your way up and you're operating the thing. But if you've been a cog and you've worked your way up through, you may not see the big picture yet, but the people who have 20 plus years of experience and they're operating the machine and they're seeing all the pieces, they would presumably know, right, that like this is not going to produce the outcomes that people want. And I think it's a little bit of wishful thinking sometimes, right? Because, everybody, what was that old line, Mark Twain one? It's like it's impossible to convince a man out of believing something that his livelihood depends on not believing, or something along those lines. I got it wrong slightly, but the idea is that like they would rather believe this fantasy if it's even vaguely plausible because it suits their interests. But that's the challenge, right? At some point, it's like, okay, but like experts have been saying for a while, we need to do a bunch of things. Those things are getting delayed by this. They're more. I think more people in the business community need to stand up and say that. Like, I'm not anti-business. I'm a former investment banker. I have an MBA. I'm a capitalist. But I know capitalism, looked different in the U.S. like 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? Like in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was a more inclusive economy. There was a stronger middle class. There was, it was it was a more equal society, at least from an economic perspective. There was better environmental protection, right? Richard Nixon founded the EPA, and Environmental Protection Agency, in 1970. You had capitalism was a version that actually seemed to kind of make sense for more of American society. The issue is in capitalism today, it's the rules that exist within the system that, the leaders aren't being vocal enough, need to be changed already, whether it's regulating tech companies that seem to have had the Wild West for 10 years to, exploit the fact that the average person doesn't know what their data is or what's being collected or what it's worth. In every industry, you see this slowness around necessary regulation to protect the public interest. And so right now, Wall Street's got a bunch of ideas saying, oh, look, stakeholder capitalism and ESG and all these things. And my answer would be, wait a second, like I went inside, looked at the machine, and my reaction was, there's nothing in this. It creates no impact. And by the way, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was no term ESG, right? Like we didn't need that. And somehow society had better outcomes. There was no parallel financial system. You know what I mean? Like, oh, here's a new system of financial assets that charge you like close to 50% higher in fees to claiming to do something environmentally conscious, which they don't even do. And so you didn't have any of those things, right? You just had a system that worked for more people. And that, I think, is ultimately comes down to the rules we set in society. And I think those are laws, and they need to be set by the referees. And I think that's the debate that needs to grow.
Yeah, 100%. It stinks because most people aren't going to listen to you talk about this, aren't going to listen to, things that are too in the weeds, as we were even talking about before the show, because, how does that affect my day-to-day life? How does that affect, whether I can pay my bills and do whatever? Like, I don't have time to worry about, these incentive structures that are just these abstract things I don't really comprehend. And therefore, but it's unfortunate, there's an old quote, and I don't remember who it's by, but it might have been Ben Franklin, saying that, the number one duty of a citizen is to question the authority that they're under. And like, not, in a, like, I'm going to find something wrong, but in a, objective way. Like, we want to make sure that we're doing the best for everybody here. Like, we're a team.
That's the thing. So you got to debate everything.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and that's one of the reasons I really like this medium of discussion, is because you can get on here, you can have a real conversation. You're not condensed down into a soundbite or a short video or whatever. You can kind of put something on the table and discuss it and talk about it and try to come to solutions and just explore it mutually together. But unfortunately, that's not a lot of the discourse that's going on in society, it seems.
Definitely not. Yeah. I mean, like Twitter and certain things, I'm use some of them and some of them not, but they don't lend themselves to nuanced discourse. Right. And exactly to your point, if people don't have that attention span or the ability to think through the nuances of the issue, it's quite difficult to change them then. Right. Because, people understand if they're getting robbed, like someone comes and grabs something out of their house, but if it's being done in some subtle way where like the system is, doing things that are legal, but effectively someone is siphoning off proceeds or, doing something that we don't really want. To your point, if it's abstract and hard to understand, then it's like really hard to get people to focus on it, right? Like it's slow moving, it's abstract, but that's how inequality's risen so much, right? Every year it gets worse, and it's incrementally worse, right? Slow moving, but it keeps getting worse. And at some point you're like, the frog that's boiling, and you suddenly realize like way too long. Yeah,
no, 100%. So Tariq, we talked a little bit about Roomie in the beginning. I would love to hear, to go back to it, I would love to hear how you started with that venture. I know you got an interesting story behind that.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I spent this career doing finance and investing and doing a bunch of things, and I kind of, it never really was what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing, right? I just kind of like, it was never what I envisioned myself doing when I was in college, and so I was in like my early-ish 30s, and this is like 2013, and around that time period, one of my close friends who I did my MBA with, he was a good friend, and then he became my roommate afterwards. He and I both used to say, hey, we're going to do something good for the world at some point, and like, something with a bit of social purpose or around some of our passion areas. We obviously graduated from B school and went back to finance because it just hoovers you up well, and you get sort of, scared about taking any other option that's different or risky or whatever. And then a few years after we graduated, he contracted stage 4 cancer. And stage 4 melanoma in particular was very difficult. And he and I were the exact same age, and we were, really close and all. And it was just sometimes when you have a close friend who goes through an experience that, is particularly meaningful or good or bad or whatever, you can live it vicariously through them. And so I kind of watched as he realized that his days were numbered because, stage 4 melanoma was less a question of your odds, more a question, unfortunately, of time. Then it was less of like, oh, I want to do something good someday. And it was like a bit more of, well, it's now or never. And so he was a blonde hair, blue eyed Dutch guy. And he went to Kenya and created an education organization there. It was a passion of his around education. I'm also passionate about education. As it happens, my parents were born and raised in Kenya. My family had been there for generations and then immigrated. And so, I was involved and watched him do it. And it kind of inspired me. And so Roomie came out because I had this idea around using technology to, bring free learning to, anyone in the world, whether they're in the corner of Detroit or in, Afghanistan, who has never had a chance, right? Because, there's so much potential of everything going digital, right? In the idea that like anyone can access it. But the data shows that a lot of the free learning not only is it like not closing inequalities in education, it's actually increasing them. Because all the benefits are going to affluent communities that have like fast internet connections and devices and so on. So Roomie basically for a number of years, we were just figuring out how to bring the free digital learning revolution to the offline world, right? So we were doing stuff in like refugee camps, we're doing stuff for girls' education in Afghanistan, like really remote parts of the world where you couldn't get anything. And it worked offline and had a few other features. And then the last few years, as we got better and better, and we expanded in a bunch of countries, all through partner organizations, and it's all our stuff's all open and free. We're a 501c3 and nonprofit. We then started to realize that there was a real opportunity to change how people learn. And what we noticed was that, which I feel like every school system noticed when the pandemic happened, but we realized that people learn differently on technology than they do like in person. And so what we'd seen was a lot of really crappy examples of education technology would be like a school saying, oh my God, the pandemic hit. Like, okay, here's our textbook. Well, we're just going to make it into a PDF. And now you can have that PDF. And I would tell them, I was like, yeah, like, listen, you could give someone a PDF of a textbook on their mobile phone, but like, good luck competing with TikTok, right? On that, right? Because the challenge is if you're in a classroom, well, here's the thing, if you're in a classroom, and there's a 60-minute lecture, right? And then it's boring and it's minute 7, you can't walk out, right? You're kind of, I mean, in theory, you can jump out the window, but like realistically, someone's going to notice, and there's social pressure, and you're kind of a captive audience. So the education space is always thinking about like, oh, we just need to make good quality learning, and that'll create like, impact or whatever, social impact. And so what we started realizing is no, it's quality times engagement, because we were doing everything digital. We're doing it around the world. We're noticing that as social media companies come in, they're particularly adept of all the companies at like hacking your brain, right? So that you basically get a dopamine rush from like, grabbing your phone and doing a 6-minute hit on Instagram. And so that's why we started switching it to micro learning, because we looking at the most recent research, we're doing work ourselves, and we're saying like, listen, if in general, micro learning seems to be more efficient, which means that like if you or I do a certain amount of time, but if we do it through micro learning, we actually retain like 22% more of what we've been taught. So it's efficient. But the second thing is, because it's micro blocks, you can make it fit into your day in any kind of moment, right? Like it's very, very easy and convenient, because it's not like sit and watch this 1-hour thing on your phone, because at that point, you end up, again, like those I think education players have found very, very difficult to compete with during the pandemic, because, if you're up against social media and it's hacked your brain and you want that dopamine rush, right, then you're going to go back to that. So what's really cool about what we've done since we started, we launched the switch to microlearning like right as the pandemic kind of hit. We pulled it a bit earlier, we launched it, and it's grown amazingly since then. It went from like 0 to 100,000 learners all organically, very, very quickly.
Wow.
And here's the cool thing, the courses on the platform are all created by volunteer educators, right? Instructional designers, so on. So we vet them when they enter our community, and then we vet the content before it goes up. So it's like Wikipedia, but we do like 5% of the work just to make sure there's quality there. But otherwise, you have really passionate volunteers around the world who were sitting at home. It's a pandemic, and they thought, hey, I can like have a way to contribute my skills and expertise all digitally that reaches other people who are also, stuck out of a program, whatever. And so, yeah, as we've scaled it, I mean, the most interesting data point I've seen, and this ties back to the Facebook and social media stuff, was that 88% of youth saying that it actually competes with social media time, because it's
Really?
Yeah. Well, here's the cool thing: the research shows you get a dopamine rush from like loading Instagram and like sort of whatever,
Sure.
Refreshing it. You also get a dopamine rush from building a new skill or concept. If you learn something discrete, you get a dopamine hit. The thing is, you have to like start and finish it. So it can't be like I open the textbook to page 13 and I read to page 16 and I close it, and it's like the middle movie of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where like it doesn't really start, doesn't really end, and you're just kind of, I always think it was like the least satisfying one. It's kind of like that. You need that. It has to be enclosed, right? You start it, you do a couple quizzes, you finish it, and you're like, I've learned X. And if you do that, you get a dopamine rush. And so we're finding that that kids get a dopamine rush, or young youth get a dopamine rush by doing something that's good for their long-term mental health. And they're actually starting to switch out of social media, because if you literally just take the Roomie, you bookmark the thing and throw it on next to your social media app, people actually then they start, whenever they have that boredom, and they like pull it out and their brain's on like autopilot, and they're like, boop, about to load whatever social media property, they actually look and they'll say, oh, let me try this instead because I have 5 minutes. And then they pick a micro course, they get a dopamine hit over months and months of time that actually kind of builds you up instead of breaking you down. So we're really excited about it, because it seems like it's a model that is really built for the modern learner.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were talking about, the attention span and that kind of thing, and people getting lost in textbooks, I was thinking about how I think TED Talk originally started the length of their doing the talks
Right.
as I think it was 22 minutes or whatever, because that's what the human attention span was optimized for. That must be so outdated. Like,
Totally.
1 decade of Instagram and Facebook, and that is just out the window. No
It
shot.
really is. It's funny because I almost wonder, I'm like, how low will it go then, right? We saw like Vine,
Yeah.
about 6 seconds, right? And now it's kind of swinging back, but it definitely, it seems like people really use their mobile phones, whenever they get bored, right? They're just trained to pull them out. Sometimes it's like you're waiting for the bus, someone's at the laundromat, again, someone's in the bathroom, whatever. But sometimes people just, they don't know, and they have a few minutes, they grab it. And they hack a lot of time out of our days like that, right? Because you don't realize it, it keeps coming, and it happens so many times, it adds up into this big amount. And all they're doing is cranking that optimization engine, because, to our earlier conversation, they're trying to focus on profit. That's not because they're necessarily bad human beings. That's because that's obviously how the system works. And they'll do it if it means that they could sell you an extremist content, or sell me like something controversial, whatever it is that they know I'll click on. Clearly may not be good for either of us in any way, shape, or form, but whatever it is, it's controversy, it sells. They're gonna feed it up so they can keep us on there and sell more ads, because they're optimizing for quarterly earnings.
Yeah, no, 100%. But it's great that you are deploying a lot of the same philosophy to something that's a lot more productive. That's incredible. So what do you see for the future of Roomie? You're at 100,000 users now. Where are you guys going from here?
So I don't know exactly, I can't remember the exact number. It's like probably 150 plus. It's accelerating, and it's all organic. And I think that, if you look at the speed with which we're doing it, we've had 3,500 people in the volunteer community who have created content, and that sort of is growing. We launched like a year ago, we had nothing. Then we created 50 micro courses and launched it. Now we crossed 1,000 like a week or two ago, and we're now creating close to 50 a week, because that whole engine is growing. And so we even work in some cases with, companies want to do volunteer work and they have employees that are really, they're like, hey, I want to do something that has impact, and they're socially distanced, or some people at home. So we'll just work with them and they'll create content that's on job skill stuff. Because our focus areas of content are job, life, and career skills. And in a lot of ways, it's the kind of things that people wish they were taught in high school, but they usually weren't, right? Because the kids curriculum is so slow that you don't even people don't learn how like a mortgage works or credit card debt. And you think about it, you're like, those are the most important, financial decisions you'll make in your life, but like they're not usually not part of the high school degree. So. Yeah,
interesting.
If you give those, but we're super responsive on a bottoms up way, right? So if people we'll built it to be as easy and engaging as possible, and the idea is just to remove the barriers, right? Because that's where we can drive the most impact for communities. Is like if you make learning fun and easy, then people and will do more of it, right? And they'll replace bad things in their life with something that builds them.
Yeah, 100%. I think, talking about the fact that it competes with social media time is huge, because I mean, what's competing with social media time? Just different social media platforms right now?
Pretty much, yeah. They're all fighting it out for a slightly growing pie, and then just beating each other up to get your time.
Yeah, no, it's crazy how it just takes up so much time. And I was listening to Sebastian Junger on a podcast, author of Tribe, and he had a new book out, I don't remember, but talk about how, he has a flip phone, and he just feels like it makes people so lonely. Although I don't know if I really agree with that analysis. I think it's kind of oversimplified. I think, you can't deny that, these social media tools are incredibly effective at helping us communicate, where they're just, going back to the incentive structure, they're just put together in a certain way to optimize profit and not to optimize the user's communication experience, right?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, these are mathematically tuned sort of things, right? And you know what they're solving for. It's the way the corporation's built. So,
yeah. Well, Tariq, this was an excellent chat. Before I let you go, I'd like to ask you one last question, just kind of random out of the box. Do you have a favorite failure that you've learned from in your past that you took a really good lesson from?
Man, I have a lot of failures. I don't know if I call any of them my favorites, but yeah, I mean, I can think of some of the early days with Roomie. There was a lot of swings and misses, right? In terms of, I'd say, so one of the early failures that I came across when I was doing Roomie was sort of this belief that that the system, I kind of had this view that you could innovate and create something really cool in the education space, and that everyone will just be like, this is better, so we should use it, right? Which, in theory is how it works in finance, right? It's very efficient. They're trying to get profit. If you show them get more profit, like they sign up the next day. And I had that sort of mindset going into the social space and education space. And I thought, well, it's like, this is going to be way better than they're going to do it. And then I realized that actually that's not how it works at all. It's very unresponsive. Like if I'm Apple and I'm selling you an iPhone, you are both the person using it and you're the person paying for it. So if you don't like it, you don't like using it, you're going to stop buying it. I have to be very responsive to you then, right? Because my funding comes from you. Education and other things are not like that, right? Because the person who's the user is like a student, right? But they don't actually go and pay money. Like they can't change schools, right? And so the system through which the funding comes means that you have a bunch of different incentives and all. To me, everything comes down to people's incentives. I'm a big fan of the show The Wire, if anyone, if you've ever seen it. But, so one of the things that I found was that I just kind of assumed that everyone would get it. And I found for a lot of social stuff, it's a lot of a longer thing where you have to really just build the relationships and do it slow. It's just not as responsive. And so that failure, I'd say, if there's a transferable lesson, it's, probably to be really careful when you enter a new industry or a new space, because, they don't always operate the way you would think they would operate, right? That this makes sense, so therefore you should do it. You get a bunch of different personalities, you get a different set of incentives, and it could take 10 years, even if you're proven that you're 10 times better, right? And anyway, that for me was the biggest learning mistake and massive failure, because I wasted a lot of time in the first year or two barking up the wrong trees and then not realizing that there was like, it was never going to work and I had to go a different route.
Yeah. No, that's a powerful lesson. Definitely got to take a step back and look at things once in a while, right?
Yeah.
Get lost in the weeds, looking at the tree, but only seeing the bark, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But Tariq, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being on. Where can people go to connect with you?
You know what? Well, Roomie is on social. First of all, people check out Roomie, roomie.org, RUMIE.org. It's all open and free. And so, you know, tell people about it, try it out. Hope it brings value to people. You know, we could follow Roomie as Roomie Learn on social media, or I'm so fancy, which is because my last name was Fancy and So Fancy was taken. So I am so fancy, which is memorable, I guess, hopefully.
I like that. Extra.
Exactly.
Well, cool, man. It was good chatting with you.
Great talking to you also. Thanks for having me.